Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're tackling a question that's been debated for ages. Did the British Empire actually make Britain wealthier?
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, isn't it?
We've got historical analyses, economic data, even personal accounts from back then. It's not a simple yes or no.
No, it's really not. What's so interesting is that there are passionate arguments on both sides.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. Imagine Britain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Think of a map with trade routes stretching from London all the way across the globe.
Yeah, you've got to picture those trade routes not just as lines on a map, but like a flow of goods unlike anything the world had ever seen.
Right?
India sending tea and cotton, Canada supplying wheat and beef, Australia practically overflowing with wool. It was a truly global network.
And a lucrative one, too, at least on the surface. By 1913, over 30% of all manufactured goods bought globally came from Britain, and a big chunk of that was going straight to the empire. So some people look at this and say, of course the empire made Britain wealthier. They had access to huge markets, a steady supply of raw materials, all the advantages of economies of scale.
Right. And economies of scale basically means the more you produce, the cheaper each item becomes. That gave big producers in Britain a major advantage in the global market. Selling to the empire meant having this massive, stable market for their goods, which could boost innovation and drive down production costs. It created, the powerful economic engine.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper. We actually found evidence of Indian tariffs that favored British goods over American ones.
Interesting.
So the empire wasn't just passively benefiting British businesses, they were actively tilting the playing field, What do you think about that?
It definitely played a role. But history, it's rarely straightforward. While the empire argument sounds convincing, some historians challenge that narrative.
Okay, so let's hear those counterarguments. One fact that supports this other side is the growth of Britain's trade with countries outside the empire, especially with the U.S. Even as the empire thrived, Britain was building strong economic ties with other nations.
Exactly. And that suggests that maybe the empire wasn't the sole key to their success. In fact, if you look at the bigger picture, Britain was facing some fierce competition from these rapidly industrializing nations like Germany and the U.S. So while Britain was focused on their imperial markets, other countries were catching up and maybe even surpassing them in terms of industrial innovation and efficiency.
Right.
Some historians argue that this reliance on the empire might have slowed Britain down, made them less adaptable when these new economic rivals came along.
It's like, imagine British factories struggling to compete with the low prices of goods made in these new industrial powerhouses. That's the kind of scenario that had some people within Britain questioning if the empire was really benefiting them. And that brings us to a really interesting conflict brewing inside Britain itself. Should they stick with free trade, which had been a cornerstone of their economic policy, or embrace protectionism and imperial preference?
Yes.
Like Joseph Chamberlain was arguing for.
Right, yeah. He was a big advocate for strengthening the empire through trade. And this debate really gets to the core of the economic dilemmas Britain was facing. Free trade, at least in theory, maximizes overall wealth. It lets goods and services flow freely across borders, which had worked well for Britain up to that point. But protectionism, well, that aims to protect domestic industries from foreign competition.
So you're basically choosing between maximizing overall wealth through open trade or protecting British jobs and industries, even if it means things cost a bit more for the average person.
Precisely. And here's a twist. Even within the empire, colonies like Australia and India started putting their own tariffs in place.
Wow.
Imagine that. Competition for British goods within their own colonial network.
It's like the empire was starting to unravel a bit, with each part looking out for its own economic interests. It makes you wonder how much control Britain really had.
Yeah, it does. It really underscores the complex dynamics at play. Colonies weren't just passively taking in British goods. They had their own economic interests, and they were willing to protect them, even if it meant challenging the economic power of the mother country.
So we've got this complex web of trade competing economic theories, even some internal disagreements within the empire. But what about the impact on the colonies themselves? Was it all just exploitation, or were there any benefits for the people living under colonial rule?
That's a really important question, and one that historians are still debating. To really understand it, we need to look at specific cases. And maybe the most significant one is India.
Right. We found the work of historian Shashi Tharoor, who argues that British rule had a devastating impact on the Indian economy.
Yeah, Tharoor paints a pretty bleak picture. He highlights this dramatic decline in India's share of the global economy. At the start of the 18th century, India accounted for a massive 23% of the world's economic output. Think about that, almost a quarter.
Wow.
But by the time India gained independence in 1947, its share had plummeted to just over 3%.
That's a huge drop.
Yeah.
It's almost like a tragic irony. India, once famous for its incredible textiles, was now just supplying raw cotton to British factories.
Yeah, it really highlights the economic strength and potential that India had before colonial rule. Thoreau argues that this decline was a direct consequence of British policies that were designed to extract wealth from India and send it back to Britain.
He talks about the destruction of India's once thriving textile industry,
Yeah.
the heavy taxes they imposed, and the way they forced Indians to grow cash crops like opium.
Right, crops that mainly benefited British merchants, not Indian farmers.
So while Britain was having this industrial boom and expanding its influence around the world, India was basically being deindustrialized. Its wealth was being taken away to support the empire. This brings up an important question. If the empire was making Britain richer, was it doing so at the expense of its colonies? Was it like a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses?
It's the core of the debate, isn't it? And it's a question that goes beyond just economics. It forces us to confront the realities of colonialism.
And it's worth noting that even people who acknowledge that the empire brought some economic benefits to Britain often admit that those benefits weren't shared equally.
Right.
It's not clear that the average British worker saw much improvement in their lives.
Exactly. In fact, some argue that all the cheap goods and labor coming from the colonies might have even hurt British workers. Imagine British textile workers losing their jobs because cheaper Indian textiles flooded the market.
That's the kind of situation that fueled the whole protectionist movement. So even for Britain, it seems like the economic impact of the empire was a mixed bag. Some people gained a lot, but others might have actually been worse off.
Yeah. It's a complicated issue. We need to look at how different social classes were affected, the long-term consequences for industrial development, and the role of government policies in all of this.
It's like peeling back layers of an onion. With each layer, we find more complexity and nuance.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that history isn't black and white. There are multiple perspectives, competing narratives, and evidence that can be interpreted in different ways.
Okay, so let's try to sum up what we've learned. While the empire definitely brought some benefits, a closer look reveals a more complicated picture. There's evidence that the British Empire did provide some economic advantages to Britain, mainly through access to markets, resources, and cheap labor.
But there's also strong evidence that those benefits came at a significant cost to the people in the colonies, particularly in places like India. British rule there led to exploitation and a decline in traditional industries. We've seen how the empire opened up vast markets and provided resources which could have fueled innovation and growth.
But we've also heard the arguments against that. The idea that relying so much on the empire might have prevented Britain from keeping pace with other industrial powers that were on the rise.
And we can't forget about the human cost. The exploitation of colonies like India raises ethical questions about the true nature of imperial wealth. When we try to figure out the economic impact of the empire, we need to be nuanced. We have to consider trade patterns, industrial development, and very importantly, the perspectives of the people who lived in the colonies.
This isn't just about numbers and statistics. It's about understanding the complex interplay of economics, politics, and human experience. All those things shaped the course of history.
Absolutely. And even with all this complexity, there are some really interesting details that came up as we went through your sources. I was particularly struck by that story of how refrigerated rail cars and advancements in transportation allowed them to ship frozen lamb all the way from Australia and New Zealand to Britain.
Yeah, imagine that. Ships traveling across the globe loaded with goods. That innovation shows how the empire actually pushed technology forward to meet the growing demand in Britain. And it might have boosted their economy.
It's amazing to think about all the challenges they had to overcome to make that happen. It speaks to the ingenuity and drive for innovation and global trade back then.
And it also highlights how interconnected the global economy already was, even way back then. The food on British tables was increasingly coming from faraway parts of the empire, thanks to new technology and the expansion of trade networks.
It's also interesting to think about those debates within Britain about the economic impact of the empire. We saw that clash between the people who supported free trade and those who preferred protectionism and imperial preference.
Right.
Those debates really reflect the anxieties and uncertainties about Britain's economic future in a world that was changing so rapidly. They also highlight the power struggles that were happening within the empire itself, both politically and economically.
So while the empire clearly had a big influence on how Britain's economy developed, it's also clear that the story is much more nuanced and complicated than a simple narrative of domination and exploitation. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's go back to that big question. Did the British Empire actually make Britain wealthier?
It's tough to say, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
The evidence we've seen suggests it's not a simple yes or no. There's a lot to consider on both sides.
Right, we've seen how the empire gave Britain access to these massive markets and tons of resources, which you'd think would fuel innovation and economic growth. But then there's that other side, the idea that maybe relying so heavily on the empire actually held Britain back, prevented them from competing with these rising industrial powers.
And we absolutely can't forget about the human costs. The exploitation of the colonies, places like India, that raises ethical questions about imperial wealth. To really understand the empire's economic impact, we need to consider a lot of things. Trade patterns, industrial development, and really importantly, the perspectives of the people who lived in those colonies.
It's about more than just numbers and data. This is about grasping the complex interplay of economics, politics, and human experience. All those things shaped history.
Exactly. And as we finish this deep dive, we want to leave you with one last thought. The empire's impact wasn't limited to just Britain. It had these ripple effects that touched the whole world, effects that we're still dealing with today. The legacies of colonialism are woven into global relationships, political systems, even social structures.
It really makes you think. History isn't just dates and facts in a textbook. It's a force that continues to shape our present and our future. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep digging into the fascinating complexities of the past.